So we are at Nelson's.
Ready?
Yeah.
So we're going? Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Most beautiful time of the year. Oh, see, look, this is oldie.
Oh yeah.
$200.
Yeah. No.
We better try it first.
Yeah, we'll try first, but. So yeah, they've changed.
Quite a bit.
Big old restaurant. Still. Music.
How are you?
The gift shop.
How are you?
Good.
How are you doing? Good. You ready? Help you? Reservation over here and a reservation over here. Okay. Restroom.
Oh, yes, I do.
Perfect. I thought they were American. Oh, it smells good.
Puts a little shrimp wrappy on it.
We got 2 rooms before we go back to the AC.
Okay.
I'll try to be quick.
No worries.
All right, folks. So before we can bottle whiskey, we gotta make whiskey, and the very first thing we gotta do is we gotta get our ingredients together, right? Our mash bill. So for the Tennessee whiskey, we're doing 70% corn, 15% red winter wheat, 15% malted barley. We're gonna grind up all these grains to a nice coarse consistency, and then we're gonna cook them in boiling water for 8 hours. Once we're done cooking the grains, we're gonna ferment the grains. This is when we're gonna be adding the yeast. The enzyme from that malted barley is breaking down those sugars to create alcohol. We make beer. This is 10% alcohol by volume, and we only get that in just 3 days of fermentation. Of course, including drunk off of this, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it because it's gonna taste like sour, boozy cornmeal. So we're gonna take this fermented mash and we're gonna load it down here into the still behind me.
Guess we're gonna follow.
So in addition to being made of copper, something that's kind of unique about our still is what we call a hybrid pots and column still, right? So that fermented mash is going to get loaded into the pots, and we're heating it up with steam. So it's a giant double boiler. Alcohol has a lower boiling point than water. So as we heat up that mash, the first thing that rises from it is the alcoholic vapor. And that vapor, as it rises through the column, it becomes concentrated by a series of plates located within that column. So the vapor that manages to get to the very top of the column is highly concentrated alcoholic vapor that we are cooling back down into liquid form. And as you can see, we're distilling right now. There's a completely clear liquid bubbling up in that kind of birdcage looking apparatus. Now we know what you're thinking. It's not moonshine, folks, because the government knows we're doing this and we're paying taxes on it, so they took all the fun out of it, right? It's not whiskey either because it hasn't touched a barrel yet. So we call this distillate, right? We're gonna take that distillate, we're gonna put it into a barrel. It's gonna live in that barrel for at least 4 years. It might stay in there 8, 10, 12, 15 years, depending on which of the products we're making. Now, the Tennessee whiskey has to travel through this first before it gets to the barrel. And Why do we do this? Well, before Prohibition, when all of the world's bourbon, or I should say all of the United States bourbon, was being produced in Kentucky, we in Tennessee, just south of them, needed a way to distinguish ourselves. Enter the sugar maple charcoal filtration process. The science behind it is this charcoal is really absorbent. And it absorbs some of the fatty acids, some of the fusel oils, some of the heavy ethers, some of that higher alcohol from the distillate gets trapped in the charcoal. So that finished product is a little bit smoother, right? We've all heard that Chris Stapleton song. That's what he's talking to, right? If I never heard it again, it would be too soon. It's a hit for a reason. Lastly, this did not become standardized until 2013. So we were doing it for hundreds of years just because that's what we did. But now, to be Tennessee whiskey, according to the not the federal government, the state government of Tennessee, it has to travel through charcoal from a sugar or maple tree in some form or fashion. So once we've done that, the Tennessee whiskey can then go into the barrel. Any questions? So it's all connected here, so it kind of works. First of all, still that was custom. So it is a contemporary still, but it's very much in the fashion of stuff that was used at the time. That's part of why we're using that design. There's a lot more science behind it, but that's above my head. Sugar maple. Yeah, for Tennessee whiskey, sugar maple charcoal. Yep. So what I have next for you is the barrels themselves, right? So we'll head into the barrel warehouse and we'll answer all of your burning questions about why would you char the inside of the barrel. See what I did there? Believe it or not, that's the first time I've made that joke. And they just recently sent us this footage of how the barrels are being made, which is a pretty fascinating process. So I'm going to stand in front of this video so I can pretend that you're paying attention to me and not. Right? The most notable thing I want to point out in this video is the charring process. I keep talking about we're lighting the inside of the barrels on fire. And there's a couple reasons why we do this. First, that's where we're getting all of the color of the whiskey. So the distillate is coming off the still clear, it's coming out of the barrel, that lovely amber color. So we can imagine that's where that color is coming from. Here's that process of charring the barrels. Now we don't just go through the process of lighting the inside of the barrels on fire just to get the brown color of whiskey, right? We do it also to activate a wood sugar that lives in American white oak, which is what we use exclusively for Tennessee whiskey and for bourbon. It's called vanillin. Its job is to protect the wood. So when you damage it, it activates the wood sugar, it rushes to the surface, and it gets caramelized by the flame. And that chemical reaction is where we're getting the vanilla, the maple, the butterscotch, the honey, all of those lovely sweet notes on American whiskey coming from these wood sugars. So we're using brand new barrels with each new batch of distillate to maintain the flavor profiles we're looking for, to maintain consistency, and to stay in accordance with federal law and state law. Now, it doesn't sound very sustainable. That's a lot of trees, right? However, it is actually pretty sustainable when we realize that these barrels are in high demand after we're done with them. They're going to go over to Scotland and Ireland to age Scotch and Irish whiskey, which are not known for being sweet, so it's rather convenient that we've absorbed a lot of that wood sugar out of the barrels before we get it to them, right? We got coffee, tea, honey, and maple syrup that's been aged in our barrels for sale in the gift shop. You can see we've used it to decorate some of the insides of these rooms here with the staves. Do you have a question?
Assuming that the cleaning and sanitation process is rather extensive before you actually send it off to Scotland for them to put their own distillate or any type of alcohols and stuff.
Yeah, I'm sure there. I don't know what the process is, but everything that's going into these barrels is around 115 proof too. So because we're dealing with pretty highly concentrated alcohol, some of that is kind of done for us, I would imagine. But yeah, definitely. Wineries and breweries are also going to buy them to do a lot of bourbon finished beer and wine. So like I said, lots of lives out of all of these barrels once we're done. Right. So the other lovely part about the barrel warehouse is the boozy Home Depot ambiance we're all experiencing. Right. And that, of course, is because of something called the angel share. So we're losing 2 to 4% of what's in every one of these barrels every year it's aged in this room to evaporation. Right. Called the angel share because they're watching over the barrels, they might as well get their cut. It's also kind of toasty in here, right? And that is because there's a video of a barrel on fire behind me. No, it's because this room is never temperature regulated, right? Tennessee, known for being very hot and humid in the summer. Less known, but still very true, we get relatively cold in the winter here still. So these barrels, exposed to the climate of Tennessee, are doing a lot of expansion and contraction. And that's part of the reason why American whiskey is bottled a little bit younger and drank a little bit sooner than whiskey that's being produced in Ireland and Scotland and Japan. Those countries don't have the hot humid summers we experience in Tennessee and Kentucky. So they need a little bit more time in their barrels, whereas we reach that spot a little bit sooner. So we let the climate of this area do a lot of the heavy lifting for us at this stage in the production step. So this is one of 2 warehouses. This is the smaller. We've got one that's 3 times this size, a mile down the road. But in this warehouse, there are approximately 700 barrels. They're almost all 53 gallons. And of course, depends on how long the barrel's been in this room. But we're going to get somewhere in the ballpark of 200 bottles out of each one of these 700 barrels. So there's a lot of whiskey in here.
Is there any priority as to which ones are here versus down the street?
Not that I know of. I mean, there could be, but yeah, mainly just convenience. Like, what is going to be bottled sooner is probably going to be over here. So this might be on the older end, and that stuff down there might be a little bit younger, maybe. If I had to guess, kind of speculate, would make sense. Yes.
What are the implications of housing barrels in this particular climate and temperature with rising overall climate? Would it, given that the longer it stays in the barrel, I mean, and you guys are doing it sooner, so I'm assuming that the amount of time that the barrel would be cut down given rising temperatures.
Potentially. Yeah, the bigger the fluctuation, the better it is for the whiskey.
Exactly. Yeah.
So our Tennessee whiskey is a range of 4 to 6 year old barrels.
Right.
Because they're being filled at any time in the year, they're going to be experiencing different weather. That's typically where we're finding the barrels are reaching that maturity part. Our bourbons are 6 to 8, and then we've done a 15-year rye whiskey as well. So, like I said, they can kind of be in here for a shorter period of time, or they might stay in there a decade plus. Right?
So
Just depends.
15-year rye whiskey, and you started in 2009?
Yes.
About 15 years ago?
Yeah. So what we did is, are you familiar with the term contract distillation?
Yeah.
So MGP, which is the country's largest contract distiller, Andy and Charlie reached out to them in 2009, and that's where Belle Meade came from. They said, our triple great grandfather was selling what we believe to be a high rye bourbon around this time, and they said, look about you, young lads, I've got all of these barrels of high rye bourbon. So they bought those barrels, they bottled it, that was Belle Meade. So we worked with them also to do the 15-year-old rye.
Does that mean that this is essentially the first year that it's become available?
It was a very, very short run. We've already sold out of it. So I got your hopes up. But your wallet will be thanking me because those were $300 bottles of bourbon. So, or of rye whiskey rather. So yeah.
Can you also talk about the color gradients based on the progression of the years?
Yeah, so this display right here is going to show you time or color versus time in the barrel, right? So all the way to the right is 1 month, still looks pretty clear. Down here closest to me is about 5 years in that barrel. So if you're looking at bottles of whiskey, the darker the whiskey, stands to reason the older it is, right? And the longer it's been in the barrel, the more of that wood sugar is absorbed. So the older the whiskey, typically we can assume that it's going to be a little bit sweeter, a little bit smoother, and a little bit more complex the longer it's spent in that barrel, right? So something to consider when we're looking at stuff on the shelf. And on our flights, we're actually going to be going up in not just proof, but in age. So we'll be able to see a little bit of gradient on your flights as well. Speaking of flights, have I whet your appetite? Are you ready to go drink some stuff and get out of this hot warehouse? All right, we're going to head back the way we came. So if you want to follow along,
Go all the way to the end.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's why I told my husband, you aren't finishing mine. I want to picture you in there.
Oh, me?
Yeah, you. Okay, we can. Oh, do that. There you go. Nice. Oh, wait, you know what? I did see your mama in there.
Yeah.
Mama in there with you. Thank you.
All right, folks. So have a seat. I apologize. The tables aren't really ADA compliant. So everybody has a seat, and everyone who's drinking whiskey who has whiskey, and some people who aren't drinking whiskey also have whiskey. Just want to make sure that no one who's drinking whiskey doesn't have whiskey, right? Seems like we're good.
Yeah, looks like it.
Fantastic. Math is not my strong suit, but we figured it out, right?
We did.
So, folks, welcome to the tasting portion. Not everyone makes it here. Not all the bachelor and bachelorette parties get this far. So, congratulations. So, before we dive in, I want to talk a little bit about the glass in front of us. Some of you have done this before. You know this glass. For those of you who aren't familiar, I want to introduce you to the Glencairn. This is the official whiskey tasting glass. There's a couple reasons why. The first one is it comes in handy when you're nosing 91 proof whiskey, which is the first thing that's going to be on our flights. We're going to be going up in proof, like I said. So rocks glasses are great for cocktails, not really great when we're trying to get all these lovely notes on the nose, because when you stick your nose deep in a rocks glass full of 91 proof alcohol and take a big whiff, which we may be inclined to do, it's not going to end very well for us, right? We're going to become face drunk, which sounds a lot more fun than it is. So this glass has been purposely designed to help us to nose higher proof whiskey without singeing our nose hairs, right? So you're going to start on the left-hand side of your flight. You're going to pick up that first Glencairn, and you're going to give it a flick of the wrist, a little spin, and you're going to bring the glass an inch or so from your nose and gently sniff like we're smelling flowers, right? And we're getting notes of alcohol, whiskey, regret, last night, Broadway, college, right?
There's some adjectives.
However, what we're looking for are those caramelized wood sugars coming from the barrels, right?
Yep.
So we're probably getting some vanilla. We're probably getting zinc you should be smelling and all that good stuff, right? So, like I said, very subjective. Everyone's going to be smelling different things at different times. To help maybe kind of guide us a little bit. Like I said, vanilla and caramel are pretty prescient on the nose. Some people get a lot of fruit on the nose of this first whiskey, right? Some people are getting a dried fruit, right? Maybe a raisin, a dried cherry, an apricot, if you will. Some people are getting more of a baked fruit. Think like apple pie with those baking spices, right? Brown sugar, cinnamon, things like that. Some people are maybe getting bananas or fresh banana bread, which is a common thing kind of throughout Tennessee whiskey, believe it or not. Regardless of what we're smelling on the nose, I guarantee you're not going to taste any of this stuff when you shoot your whiskey.
Right.
Now, I'm not above shooting my whiskey. What do you think I'm going to be doing as soon as I lock those doors at 7 p.m. this evening, right? However, if we're wanting to experience all these lovely notes, we're going to chew our whiskey instead, right? So this process, I'm going to ask you to take a small sip of that first glass of whiskey. You're gonna swish it around your mouth for a few seconds and make sure you swallow it. We're not doing a wine tasting, right? And then exhale. And you're immediately salivating and wondering why I made you do this, right?
It's yummy.
A couple reasons. Well, the reason you're salivating is because your body is actually not designed to drink 91 proof alcohol, but we do it anyway because it's fun, right? Exactly. Now, your body is taking that saliva and it's trying to dilute 91 proof alcohol. It's trying to protect you, folks. Also, your body knows you better than anyone. It knows you're dumb enough to do this again and again and again. So it's reserving some of that saliva to create a barrier around our tongue and our taste buds. So each subsequent sip of the whiskey, it's going to be a little bit smoother, a little bit more complex, and a little bit more enjoyable now that we've done the proverbial cannonball into the deep end of the pool, right? So congratulations for the rest of the tour. I'm not going to ask you to swish your whiskey. You just sip it all normal, right? So on that second sip of that same glass of whiskey, now that we have chewed it, it's going to be a little different going down that second tap. So, like I promised you, we are starting with that Tennessee whiskey. I mentioned in the barrel warehouse that this is 4 to 6 year old barrels that have been blended. So this is the youngest whiskey on our flights. It is also 91 proof because we actually didn't know what the original Tennessee whiskey was being bottled at because proof wasn't really being regulated before Prohibition all that much. So we decided 91 proof because Charles died in 1891. Louisa took over in 1891. So it's 91 proof, right?
Cute.
Corn, wheat, malted barley. Something that also is really unique about our Tennessee whiskey, we're not dealing with any rye, which is very rare for a Tennessee whiskey in general. So this is a wheated Tennessee whiskey. And as we get into the other whiskeys, we'll talk a little bit more about the significance of those flavors and how they're different. But no way to cut it other than the fact that we wouldn't be sitting here today on a Friday afternoon if it wasn't for this. This distillery would not exist in 2024 if it wasn't for those notes and if it wasn't for that Tennessee whiskey of Charles Nelson. So building off of this, Andy and Charlie have now released the Nelson Brothers line of whiskeys. These are obviously contemporary whiskeys, very much in the style of stuff that was found in the United States before Prohibition, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about the significance of those flavors and what that means in a second. I do want to take a moment to mention that our time together in this tasting portion is limited. However, you have until 7 p.m. this evening to finish what's in front of you. So, anything we do not finish in the next 10 to 15 minutes, I encourage you to take with you to enjoy the band, go to the bar. If you're staying for lunch, you can bring the whiskey to your table. You can take it with you as you shop. Just remember, for better or worse, we're not in New Orleans, so don't leave with open containers of alcohol if you can help it.
Remember.
So that being said, don't feel obligated as I move through the next few rather quickly. Don't feel like you got to try to keep up with me, all right? So that being said, I do want to transition from the Tennessee whiskey to the bourbon, which is in the second glass. So now we've got our Nelson Brothers Classic Bourbon. So let's talk about what we're smelling. And what I want to focus on is the difference between these two whiskeys. What are we getting here that we maybe didn't get on the Tennessee whiskey? Or maybe things we're getting in addition to, right? Mm-hmm. Butter.
Orange.
Get some orange, some citrus. Most people find that maybe the second one's a little bit more subtle on the nose than the Tennessee whiskey.
Yes.
Right? Maybe we're getting a little bit more sweetness. Maybe we're getting,
There's still some ethanol in there.
Now,
Tiny bit of spice.
describing what a whiskey smells like is a little bit more difficult than describing what a whiskey tastes like. So if you haven't yet, go ahead and take a sip of this one.
I like this part.
Yeah. Definitely.
So based on some of these reactions and facial expressions, would it be safe to say that maybe we found this one to be a little smoother than the Tennessee
Yeah.
whiskey,
Yeah.
right? Maybe we're getting a little bit additional sweetness on the finish.
Yeah. Smooth.
Maybe we're getting a little bit of spice or a little bit of bite on the finish, right? So, I kind of have alluded to this throughout the production side of the tour, but Tennessee whiskey and bourbon are very similar. In most cases, they share more in common than they don't. The primary distinction between Tennessee whiskey and bourbon, of course, is the filtration, right? So, for all intents and purposes, there are about 4 rather subtle differences between our Tennessee whiskey and the bourbon you're drinking now. They've gone through all of the same production steps. They're going into the same barrels. The bourbon is not being filtered through the charcoal, right? So that's the first difference. Now, the bourbon is also a little bit higher proof. It's 93.3. But most of us found it to be smoother. What gives? Number 3, it's aged longer in the barrel. So we're dealing with blends of 6 to 8-year-old barrels as opposed to 4 to 6-year-old barrels. So we've absorbed a little bit more wood sugar. We're a little sweeter. We're maybe a little smoother as a result of that. Now, did anyone get a little bit of, like I said earlier, some spice, a little bit of bite on the finish here, right? Just a little bit. So,
Power of suggestion is strong.
yeah, there's the power of suggestion at play, but also our bodies are different. We're going to react to it differently, right? So, so your truth might not be your neighbor's truth in this context, right? So keep that in mind. But I think pretty commonly people translate rye to have a little bit of spice to it. So the Tennessee whiskey, no rye. The bourbon, 27% rye, right? So we call this a high rye bourbon or a pre-prohibition style bourbon because a lot of American whiskey, or I should say North American whiskey, was high in rye content before prohibition because rye was cheap. So we're using it to flavor our whiskeys in abundance. These were the same whiskeys that were around when we were inventing the mint julep, the Sazerac, the Manhattan, the old fashioned. Guess what? This makes those cocktails very good. These makes very good cocktails. Right? I swear to God, I haven't had a drop of it today yet. But most of our old fashions, for example, are going to be made with this at the cocktail bar, right? So, slightly higher proof, a little bit more time in the barrel, not being filtered through charcoal from a sugar maple tree, and one is being primarily flavored with rye, and one is primarily being flavored with wheat. Seems pretty insignificant. Now, some of us who consider ourselves to be a little bit more of an aficionado, and some of us that are maybe a little bit more novices with this whiskey stuff, each one of you were able to, in your own way, kind of pick up on some of these differences, right? Just by smelling and definitely by tasting this stuff, they make a pretty big difference. So there's a lot of moving parts, but they all add up to, you know, something kind of a little different than one another. Yes?
When you look at the bourbon in the glass, it looks physically more viscous. Is that sugar that you're seeing?
I think it translates to that too. And this is going to come into play when we get to the last one. Because I find the last one to be a lot thicker, and it sticks a little bit more, you know, to borrow from the wine world. It has nice legs, right? But yes, I think you're definitely onto something with that sugar content and kind of that viscosity that we're getting from the whiskeys that are aged a little bit longer, for sure. Yeah. So we've got a wheated Tennessee whiskey. We've had a bourbon. Now we're going to go to rye. I heard some oohs, and sometimes I hear some groans, right? Rye's not everyone's favorite. And let's talk a little bit about it, right? So remember the bourbon you just drank. Remember that spice, that bite. That's 27% rye. A lot of ryes that are available right now are close to 80 to 90% rye. So imagine that spice and bite and that peppercorn flavor and times it by 3. Let's be honest, that's not going to be everyone's favorite sip, right? Now, something that is very unique about our Tennessee whiskey, about our rye whiskey rather, is we took the mash bill from the classic bourbon. Remember folks, bourbon has to be majority corn, rye has to be majority rye. So we took the mash bill for the classic bourbon and we flipped it to make it a rye. So 64% corn now becomes 64% rye. The 27% rye of the bourbon becomes 27% corn on the rye. They both contain 9% malted barley. They're both blends of 6 to 8 year old barrels. 93.3 proof, 92.5. So we're very close in age and proof. The primary difference is the amount of corn and the amount of rye, which is where you're going to get that huge variance in the flavor, right? Our rye is a little sweeter because we got that corn, and we're doing this in brand new barrels, which we're not required to do for rye. So we're going to get a little bit more sweetness than some of the ryes we've had before, right? This one is also going to be a little bit, it's going to have the tingle, it's going to have a little bit of the bite, but it's going to finish a little bit more on the herbaceous side, less on kind of the sharp, harsh, peppery side, right? I don't expect to have converted all of you to rye, right? It has its kind of, fans and its uses, right? I'm a big Manhattan drinker. I love using this to make my Manhattans and things like that. But it is another tool in the toolbox, or another, ingredient in your bar to make cocktails with, or to just drink on its own. Some people really love rye. So hopefully you won't treat all ryes the same, because they are very different from one another, right? Rye's a little bit like cilantro, right? Our bodies react to it differently.
Yeah, very much.
And we all have very strong opinions about
Yeah, you love it
cilantro,
or you hate it.
right? So
I love it.
You like
do with
soda?
that what you will, right?
Top tier green vegetable.
Yeah.
So we've gone through 1, 2, 3, glass number 4. Where are we to go?
Sweet.
We're going back to bourbon. But you're not wrong about sweet, right? So what are we getting on the nose of the Nelson Brothers Reserve in your 4th glass there?
Oh, molasses.
Definitely getting aged, yeah, for sure. It's darker, you probably noticed. So it stands to reason that it's aged longer, like we talked about, right? And that comes with maybe some additional sweetness on the nose, right? We're getting some of the vanilla and caramel that we got on the classic, but maybe we're getting some deeper sweet notes, like some molasses and toffee and maple and butterscotch, right? Kind of tastes like a Werther's, right?
Yeah.
So if you haven't yet, go ahead and take a sip of this one. And for the record, you're drinking my favorite, so it's a little bit smoother. This is the Nelson Brothers Reserve Bourbon, right?
Yep.
So what's the difference between the classic and the reserve, right? Believe it or not. Sorry, what was it?
It's about 20 bucks.
Price. So there's 3 differences. Right? It's the same whiskey, going into the same barrels. It's staying there longer, and it's left at a higher proof. You are drinking 7 to 11-year-old barrels, right? So they've absorbed a lot more of that wood sugar, like we talked about. It's thicker, it's viscous, it's got more of that sugar content to it. It's also got a lot more of those sweet notes as a result of that. This is actually 107.8 proof whiskey. Doesn't drink like it for the most part, right? So we got to be a little bit careful when we're drinking this stuff, folks, right? If I'm drinking one of the 4 I've poured up for you by itself, 10 out of 10 times, right? Unless I'm paying for it, right? It's a $70 bottle of bourbon, right? I'm a tour guide who works for tips. Those things don't always work out so well. Now, that being said, a 7 to 11-year-old blended whiskey left at 107.8 proof that was called a top 10 whiskey in the world by Whiskey Advocate last year, $70. We know how, some of us know very intimately how expensive some of this boutique whiskey can get. It's a pretty good deal, especially when you remember that you get 10% off in the gift shop with your tickets. So it's even a little cheaper, right? Now,
Did we get our 10% off that?
We got a little bit discount.
I don't know if it applies to the,
I'm
to
sure.
the honey cask.
I'm sure. Yeah.
But,
But we got $14 off because we tried it first.
there you go.
No, we
Fantastic.
got $14 applied to it.
Well, that's what I meant. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
Never mind.
It's a rebate.
It was very good though.
Folks, so you came on a special day, so I'm going to use this as a segue to talk about the honey cask finish. So you may have seen some signage and stuff about the honey cask finish. What is cask finish whiskey? Well, bourbon, like we said, and Tennessee whiskey has to spend its whole life in a brand new American white oak charred barrel. There is a little workaround that we exploit here, and we're not the only ones. We're going to take a fully matured barrel of bourbon. It's ready to be bottled, but before we bottle it, we're actually going to take that whiskey out of that first used barrel, and we're going to put it into a used barrel for about 6 to 12 months. And there's actually on your flights are all repurposed barrel staves, and there's a barrel stave in the middle of the table. You're going to notice a dark brown line running through your flights and running through that stave. In that case, that's whiskey that got trapped in there, but that's going to happen to any liquid that gets stored in a barrel. So the concept is, our fully matured bourbon is entering that second cask, and it's traveling into that wood, and it's absorbing whatever was trapped in the wood before it, right? And the reason we can do this and still call this bourbon is because of the modifier finished in so-and-so cask, right? Cask finished bourbon, right? So we have some different casks up here. we've taken a fully matured classic and we put it into a French cognac cask for 6 to 12 months, let it absorb some of that French cognac, right? We've done this also with Mourvedre, which is a red wine. We get those casks from California. Calvados, which is a French apple brandy. And the Black Brier is a unique one. The Black Brier and the honey cask are very similar in their execution and concept, right? So for the case of the Black Brier and the case of the honey, which we released today, we gave our barrels to either a brewery who used our barrels to finish their imperial stout, or we gave them to a beekeeper who put his local organic honey in our barrel. Once the brewery and the beekeeper are done with the barrels, they gave those barrels back to us, and we put a 9-year Nelson Brothers Reserve for 6 to 12 months in those casks. So they're going to take on either the lovely notes of that imperial stout or the lovely organic local honey notes from the honey that was aged and finished in those barrels. Now, the honey is not cheap, as you can imagine, right? We're talking about a $200 bottle here, right? So this bottle is not going to be found anywhere outside of the building, outside of the distillery, and when it's gone, it's gone. So if you want a very special bottle, if you are a really big fan of whoever's watching your cat back home, you want to give them a little souvenir, I'd say a $200 bottle of Nelson Brothers cask finish honey would do the trick, right?
Do you guys ship?
So we unfortunately cannot ship to consumers. It's one of Tennessee's many bugaboos. However, Tennessee does not have any qualms with you shipping home some barbecue sauce, some olive oil, some lava lamps, jars of pickles, snow globes. Get really creative here. What the U.S. government doesn't know can't hurt them, right? Now, the cask finishes only really found here. Everything that you just drank is available in all 50 states. So if you go home and you've got one of those big chain stores, you got your Total Wine, a Bevmo, a Specs, a Benny's, wherever you live, they're probably already on the shelf. What's that?
State stores.
The state stores should have them because we do distribute to all 50 states.
So you Ohio?
Pennsylvania, it's all state stores.
Okay.
Pennsylvania, Virginia, they're all state run.
Just give us your email. We're from Indiana. We'll ship you some pickles.
We also live less than a mile in Delaware and Maryland.
Oh, then you're totally
There you go.
But it's not technically.
So folks, keep your eyes peeled for like I said, these 4 products because they should be in the stores. Some more readily available than others, of course, right? Now I do have one last thing for you. And unfortunately, it's not the honey. But it is very sweet and it's very delicious and it comes courtesy of Louisa. So we've got dessert poured up for you. So as we exit, I'm going to hand you a glass of Louisa's distilled sugarcane liqueur where we've added extracts of coffee, caramel, and pecan. Right? So guess what? It's really great in your morning coffee. It's only 40 proof, so they'll never know, right? It's great for cooking and baking, desserts in particular, marinades and barbecue sauces. It's $25. It's got no dairy. You don't need to refrigerate it. The catch is, it's not in all 50 states.
Of course.
It is only in Tennessee, Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Kansas, Missouri, New York, and Minnesota. So, some of you are going to be shipping home some snow globes, right? Here's the thing. This is probably our #1 bestseller in the gift shop, so it's going to have wider distribution eventually.
Yeah.
Keep your eyes peeled, but in the meantime, act accordingly. So, in addition to whatever you're still sipping on your flights, I'm gonna hand you the Louisa's liqueur, and like I said, you can take it anywhere in the building you want. And I need to thank you guys for your attention, your patience, and your drinking habits.
Yeah, for sure.
These or the
The last one was good.
Just all like what I remember, for sure. But I mean, it's not 100% what my profile is, but I absolutely 100% love the history of this place.
Yep.
And this bottle, I love this bottle.
Love that label.
I feel like, don't we have a 108, a little 375 of a 108 something. It has a
Yeah, we have 2 of their special blends back in 2017.
I'm also going to drink this bottle.
Yeah, I don't.
So we're done with the tasting and the tour, and they leave you off in the gift shop. And yes, we purchased more stuff. So we got a couple of bottles of So we got 2 bottles of that, one for us and one for as a gift. That's really sweet. I thought it was going to be like a bourbon cream, but it's more just like a flavoring that would go in coffees. And then I picked up a bar mat, which is really thick. And then we got a rocks glass over there. Dawn got a shirt, and she is checking out now.
Are we good?
Oh yeah, we're good.
You guys did the tour, yeah?
Yes.
We did.
I'll say 10%.
All right.
Yes, we did.
Is that retroactive for the honey that we got this morning?
I'm so sorry.
You know how they get you.
So, starting with the history, we're going to start where the whiskey starts. That's going to put us here at Nashville in the mid-1860s. In this photo, we've got Charles and his eldest son, William. And we've got our distillery foreman, Henry Bollinger, to be mentioned, because Bollinger was a meticulous note taker. He actually left behind step-by-step instructions of how these guys were making Charles' best-selling product, which was his Tennessee whiskey. How popular was it, you ask? He was outselling his nearest Tennessee rival she's facing as a woman in the United States in the late 1800s. But Louisa gets the Tennessee whiskey all across the United States. It even finds its way across the globe in places like the Philippines, France, Russia, parts of Germany, and the UK. Louisa also, in 1906, trademarks our Tennessee whiskey label. You can notice our contemporary bottles have that label on it, all because of her foresight over 100 years from here. I am very confident Louisa would have continued to run the distillery longer than 18 years if we, in the state of Tennessee, did not decide to start Prohibition a decade before everyone else. 1909, Prohibition comes to the state of Tennessee. So the Nelsons load up all of their barrels of whiskey, put them on a train, secretly under the cover of night, they ship it all the way up to Kentucky. For the next 6 years, they sell off all that remaining whiskey through Louisville, Kentucky. Now, why did we start Prohibition so much sooner in Tennessee? Well, we know the temperance movement, right? Which would lead to national prohibition. Guess where they got their start? Well, this area in general, but yes, Tennessee. It was a hotbed of temperance protest. So we started a decade before the rest of the country. And that movement, the temperance movement, if you remember, was predominantly led by religious leaders and by women. So we got to think about Louisa, who was a woman running one of the country's bigger distilleries. She's starting to feel a little awkward, right? So the Nelsons, once that whiskey is sold off, by 1915, the Nelsons are going to become a banking family. They're going to do everything in their power to disassociate the family connection to alcohol and alcohol production. So Charles is going to be remembered as a moonshining granddad to the later Nelson generations, instead of being recognized as the rather prolific distiller I described him as earlier. So after Louisa dies in 1918, a lot of the history of the distillery and the Tennessee whiskey starts to slowly die. And it does not come back alive until almost 100 years later, in 2006. Because the triple great-grandsons of Charles and Louisa stumble upon a historical marker which starts to tell them the story of their family lineage. Now, put it into a little bit more context, Andy and Charlie Nelson, the triple great-grandsons of Charles and Louisa, grew up in the area. They had a moonshining grandparent on their family tree. And what? So did everyone else. And we can all remember, in our early 20s, we're not really that interested in our family history or family lineage, right? We've got other things on our mind, right? So Andy and Charlie have graduated college, so they're in their early 20s. They stumble upon a historical sign where Charlie Nelson sees his birth name, and he is instantly drawn to it, of course, starts reading about a guy owning and operating a distillery before Prohibition. And he's pretty certain that they're talking about that triple great-grandfather. So Andy and Charlie get really excited about the prospect of being the Nelsons to resurrect the old family business, right? Now, you're not going to get very far in the whiskey business with a history or philosophy degree. Speaking from some personal experience. Right? So Andy and Charlie are going to divide and conquer. Charlie's going to focus on marketing the whiskey, running the business. He's going to kind of become the head of he's going to become the CEO, essentially. While his brother is going to learn production. He's going to learn how to make the whiskey. And Andy's going to be our head distiller. So 6 years after stumbling fatefully on this historical marker, Andy and Charlie release Bellmead Bourbon in the year 2012. Bellmead Bourbon won Andy & Charlie double golds at the World Spirits Competition the year it came out, which is no easy feat. So they hit the ground running, kind of trying to build up their reputation and the reputation of the distillery. Now, while that is making the rounds throughout all 50 states, Andy and Charlie are kind of quietly working on their triple great grandfather's Tennessee whiskey right here in this building, and they're doing so following the step-by-step instructions left behind by Henry Bollinger, because the custodians of those notes were the lovely folks at the Greenbrier Historical Society. Considering Greenbrier, or the distillery, was the largest employer of the town of Greenbrier, they were pretty stoked at the idea of the distillery. So, we are making the Tennessee whiskey how it was made before Prohibition because of Henry Bollinger's notes. Now, they weren't regulating everything back then. We're regulating it now. So there's some slight differences, keep in mind, right? No one's going to be going blind. But yeah, we're doing that same recipe here at the distillery, which we're going to show you in just a moment. They also discovered that Charles was the first person to trademark Tennessee whiskey. He beat everyone in the state to that trademark by 7 years. So according to the federal government, what we're making here is the original Tennessee whiskey. So we don't throw the old O word around, willy-nilly. Now, the first bottle of the Tennessee whiskey did not officially go back on sale until October 1st of 2019. So about 100 years lost the time that Tennessee whiskey to find it back. So, of course, that's the first thing we're going to be drinking on our plates. In addition to the Tennessee whiskey, we've got 2 bourbons and a rye whiskey on your plate as well. Now, some of you probably know the ins and outs of all this stuff about the differences between all of these types of whiskeys, but to make sure we're all on a level playing field, I'm going to break it down right now. We got to start with whiskey, of course, because everything we're drinking is whiskey. Whiskey is any grain-based spirit aged in a barrel or wooden vessel. Rather nebulous category, right? Rye whiskey is any whiskey that is just 51% high. Made anywhere, right? Now, bourbon has lots of rules and regulations. I'm not going to bore you with all the minutia. 3 things you need to remember, or are useful to remember. I can give you any more. It's the ABCs, right? Bourbon has to be made in America, so A stands for America. It has to be made on U.S. soil. B stands for barrel, because bourbon has to be aged in a brand new American white oak charred barrels. And C stands for corn. Unlike rye, bourbon's got to be 51% corn. Now, those 3 rules of bourbon also apply to Tennessee whiskey. Tennessee whiskey, additionally, can only be made in the state of Tennessee. Go figure. Tennessee whiskey also has to be filtered through charcoal from sugar maple trees before we can age it in its own grand American white oak counters. Yeah, like I promised, there's no homework, there's no test, there's no quiz, there's just whiskey, right? So, contractually obligated to disseminate this information, and now you folks get to choose what you want to do with that. But rest assured, on our production tour, we're going to show you the filter. We're going to talk about the history behind the sugar maple charcoal filtration and some of the science as to why we do it. We're also going to go into one of the barrel warehouses. We're going to show you the barrels, talk about why they're American white oak, why we like the inside of the gunfire, why we like to use the woods, right? So hopefully all those burning questions will be answered, but if you still have questions remaining at the end, we'll talk about some of the stuff we maybe didn't cover. So as we're heading through production, feel free to take any photos or videos. Ironically, the start of our production tour is the end of the production process. Blending and bottling is the last thing that's going to happen before you get to drink things. Now, folks, this is not a narrative choice by me, right? This is just the layout of the building. So, I want to primarily focus on what makes whiskey before it makes it to the bottle. But this first room is very important because if you go home and you find some of the stuff that we're drinking here today at the liquor store, just know that bottle had to travel through this room we're about to walk through before it made it all the way to that shelf on the way where it is, right? So all of our stuff is going to be traveling through this singular bottle. So it's pretty cool, right? How are we feeling? Fantastic. All right.
Nice energies. Good job. Stop that. Somewhere up that. No.